welcome to the ICT Pulse podcast. I'm Michelle Marius, your host and the editor and publisher of ICT Pulse, the online platform where we discuss ICT issues from a Caribbean perspective. Today we'll be revisiting the Caribbean Single ICT Space with Jennifer Britton, Deputy Program Manager, ICT for Development at the CARICOM Secretariat in Ghana. Jennifer was on the show last year and gave us a primer on the Caribbean Single ICT Space. At the end of that episode, she mentioned some then upcoming activities that should be a big boost to the Single ICT Space initiative. So, in addition to getting an update on milestones that have been achieved to date, we are hoping that Jennifer will give us the scoop on the latest plans and developments and help us to understand the implications of the St. Anne's Declaration on the Single ICT Space. Jennifer, welcome back.
Thank you, Michelle, and thank you as always for taking time to have us share some thoughts and aspirations with regard to and plans with regard to what the Secretariat is working on for the region in ICT for development.
Okay, so Jennifer, when you were last on the show last August, can you imagine a year has flown by already?
Indeed, and so quickly.
Yes. But so what has happened since with respect to the Single ICT Space initiative?
Thank you, Michelle. Good question, and you're always putting me on the spot, but thank you. We continue to work assiduously at the Secretariat level with regard to the Single ICT Space. I think last year when we talked a little bit, we may have touched a bit on the strategic plan for the region and where that single space how that single space profiles in the strategic plan. If we didn't, it's probably a good opportunity to say that the region had a strategic plan spanning the years 2014 to 2019, and the single ICT space is the central core of the technological resilience pillar. So we've been working, obviously any work that we do at the technical level at the Secretariat and with member states will impact on the strategic plan. So I'm quite happy to share that with you and your listeners. In terms of what we've done and what we've been able to accomplish, it's getting a little more, unfortunately, complex to even measure that sometimes. We are in a space where everything is being discussed in technologies in every sentence, but yet I don't feel very strongly yet that we're actually measuring and moving towards on a single pathway, which may never happen towards the single ICT space. That having been said, we are happily in a place where we're gearing up towards a quoted ICT and ICT ministers meeting sometime in September or October, not later than November of this year. And we have a number of, I would think, solid items to put before the ministers and some decision-making requests of the ministers, which will take us further along the line of the single ICT space. So we have been working in the last year with looking at development partners to see what type of funding may be available to the region, and as you know, it does not come from one conversation. We've also been looking at what are the possible quick wins and also the things that could engage the whole region because of its importance to everything we do as a region in terms of how we work for the single ICT space. And I'm sure we'll discuss more of those as the conversation continues.
Okay, thanks. Ali, thanks for setting that up for us. But I guess ultimately, one of the things that you're saying, granted, talking about complexities, things certainly not happening in a single conversation, that the quoted meeting probably where some important decisions will be made has not happened as yet. I gather that we probably may be, I'm hoping not, keeping my fingers crossed, a little bit more behind than we were when we last spoke last year. How would you rate us in terms of the progress that we have made to date?
The tenets of the single ICT space, as we spoke about before, really rely on what is happening in member states. So whether or not the quoted ICT actually meets to determine on some big regional blocks of things, in every member state, very positive things have been happening as you look across the member states with a bird's eye view. So in terms of looking from the Secretariat's point of view and seeing what member states are doing, I think we're checking off probably every box with regard to moving forward for the single ICT space. As I said, it's not being done. I don't get the sense that it's being done with the single ICT space as the target, but eventually when we add up everything that's being done, the parts will make up some significant pieces of the single ICT space. I would prefer, and I guess that's my personal preference, but I think from even the Secretariat's point of view and for the region's benefit, it would be useful if our efforts were really looking towards the big goal of the single ICT space, talking about it, and actually measuring it against that. For example, you will notice that everybody is talking either implicitly or explicitly about digital skills. People are talking about really upgrading the STEM curriculum in their education systems, but we don't have regional policy on it yet. People are talking about and have held robotics camps. People have held hackathons for application development. Persons are looking to develop electronic currency for government and that type of thing. So they're hitting probably every major check mark, but we're not doing it in tandem and we're not doing it based on a regional agreement or a full construct in the single ICT space.
Do you think that we should be in terms of whether or not, I almost feel sorry for asking because the odds are going to fall on your lap. But do you think that perhaps we need those sorts of interventions? Because as much as, all countries or most of the countries in the region are doing their own thing with respect to, digital transformation, digital skills, digital economy, all of these, wonderful catchphrases, they don't cohere towards us as the single ICT space and what that entails. Yes, you may have some of the initiatives complementing the single ICT space, but they may not all be doing so, or the majority of them may not. And that is going to cause, adjustments to be made or frictions to exist. So I'm wondering the extent to which we ought to be proactive in trying to remedy those challenges, especially if we see the long-term goal as a single ICT space, and we already recognize that everybody's just not singing from the same hymn sheet for all intents and purposes.
Correct, and it is a many-sided question and a many-sided answer. I think that the bigger picture for us, even bigger than the single ICT space, is the CARICOM Single Market and Economy, and some of our discussions have to be, as a mature region, where does technology, and in our case, the single ICT space, fit into that construct? I think if we start to examine that question, we will get better answers and we will be able better to, for want of a better word, ensure that the right publics are dealing with what needs to be done in the single ICT space to make the CARICOM Single Market and Economy as prosperous and as built out as it can be. So you're right, it is probably something that is going to land on my desk, but it shouldn't stay at my desk, because in terms of the discussion that we started last year with digital economy, and you have put in the new catchphrase of digital transformation, if the region, I think, even takes a step back, breathes, and starts to look at ourselves in light of digital transformation, I think it will make our job easier. But the other side of the answer as well is that we need to have some prescriptive policies with regard to how we want to move forward with ICT, and that is where I think the Secretariat's role comes in, and where hopefully with the intervention of having an ICT ministers meeting more often than we do, that a lot of these policies could be rolled out, and so member states have sort of a guidepost towards which they're working.
Understood. But I was also thinking as you're talking, and certainly, I am pretty far removed from the discussions that have been happening on CSME and the single ICT space, at least with respect to CARICOM and talking with heads of states, etc. And I'm wondering, and I would love to have your thoughts on it, do you think that among policymakers that they look at CSME and the single ICT space almost like an abstract concept or idea, but not necessarily something that they feel particularly grounded, that is particularly grounded from the perspective of they seeing what the end point is or what the outcomes ought to be. If we achieve the single ICT space, if we achieve CSME, what would that look like for our countries? Do you have a sense that they fully understand what the vision is?
I think you're trying to get me in trouble, but that answer probably should be better answered at the political level, which is a higher level and a different level from mine. Thankfully, my um, my answer would be the fact that we have this beautiful tool of the 20th and 21st century called technology in its widest sense. It could have been something else. We might have decided that water management may have gotten us to the sustainable development goals or whatever. I think that it is a golden opportunity for the region to be able to look at the processes and the thoughts and the actions that were planned for the single market and economy, and to map them against how technology may help hinder or advance some of those processes. So it is not, we are a mature region. I don't think that the CSME could in any way, shape, or form be considered an aspiration. We've been working towards it too long, and I think getting some positives out of it in many areas. ICT is just another area, and we need to pursue it as much as we've pursued trade and economic development and even human resource development to a certain level. But ICT is two-pronged or probably even three-pronged, because while we pursue it as let's say, a community objective, it also is a tool which can help you make those objectives a lot easier to be achieved in some instances. So we are still at a point where we need to have that conversation, and we need to start intentionally injecting ICT and the technology discussions and opportunities into every discussion that happens on the CSME.
Understood. And you had mentioned, in just talking about CSME, one of the developments that I read about at least a few months ago now was the St. Anne's Declaration, which I think was signed in Trinidad late last year, early this year, and it's supposed to be on CSME. But I wondered whether or not does the new declaration have any impact on the single ICT space? Any of the commitments or elements of that? Does it somehow shed new light on what should be going on with the single ICT space?
Again, not shedding any new light that I can think of right off the bat. But I am delighted every morning when I wake up. It's a fabulous time to be alive, because in every sentence of every declaration that is made across the world, even not only in our region, I can find an opportunity for ICT for these. So I have a lot of joy at my desk. That having been said, again, the answer that I gave you just a minute ago about the conversations are the place where they need to happen. For example, I am intrigued that we could, well, and thinking about the possibilities of where we could use technology much more easier to support, to make free movement, for example, much easier. If we started with the premise which we talked about several years ago, about even at the empirical level, giving every citizen an ID number, which is a CARICOM ID number. Once you start to, for want of a better word, tag each citizen, that number follows you into your airline reservation, into your hotel reservation, and everything else. So we know where people are. And it is not, it may be difficult because there are other processes that need to support it. We probably need to put it at the level of births in every hospital and all of those things. But it is not something that's not doable. It could even be done, heaven forbid, manually. If we just had a list of every citizen in each country and just started to do it manually. But something, and people, as you know, across the world are rolling up to what are called digital IDs. So this CARICOM ID could be mapped onto a digital ID. And so at any given day, moment, or hour, I would know where Michelle was in the community. So things like that, and when we talk about free movement, I can see adding something like that onto it, which allows us to feel a little freer as we move. Even our, what do you call them now, the immigration and departure forms that we fill moving from each CARICOM country. We've standardized those. And I see the next level of it being an application where we put it into an application, and it actually helps a lot of our citizens, because I am very conscious as I travel that our colleagues and brothers and sisters from Haiti and Suriname sometimes do have challenges when they come into the English speaking Caribbean and have to complete those forms. So the possibility in a simple app of having their own translation right in their app, which allows them to fill it up, in a minute rather than 10 minutes, is something which supports free movement. So in every sector, although sadly ICT for D was not mentioned frontally in the St. Anne's Declaration, the spirit of the declaration allows us to look at it as a region and infuse ICT and technology into perhaps every big objective in that declaration and move the CSME forward.
Absolutely. Just going back to the point you mentioned about the CARICOM ID, and it's something that I've been hearing more and more, probably more from individuals within the community than the policymakers themselves.
Yes.
Right? And here it is that a number of countries across the region are in the throes, whether or not just beginning to conceptualize or about ready to implement some sort of national ID, digital ID, etc. And, you may have a country, as populous as Jamaica with nearly 3 million people, but you also have, a country like BVI with 30,000 people, all looking at, Yes. And you question matters related to economies of scale, scope, then the whole integration elements that we hope will be fostered in having CARICOM through CSME, etc. And I guess it just leaves me to question and to just think about why is it so difficult for us to do things regionally still? I mean, CARICOM is 45 years old now, and we still seem to be challenged by some of the sovereignty issues, I think. And I mean, I am cognizant that all of the countries, as much as we are the same generally, we have, idiosyncrasies, and we are not fully at the same level of development. We don't do things exactly the same way. So there will be things that would need to be navigated when we take a fully regional and harmonized approach to certain things. But here it is that we are having individual conversations on the same topic, and I don't know the extent to which we have fully discussed doing some of these things on a regional basis.
Yes, it's a good observation, and it's something that keeps me up daily, because I think the construct of the region is supportive of everything we want to do, because we have enough bodies and committees, etc., to do it. Part of the challenge, I think, is that we again are not using even the power of communication without the technology. We're not writing to each other. We're not picking up the telephone. We're not, to have what I would call cross-pollination discussions. And so one of the big things that I hope to have the ICT ministers agree to when we meet in another couple of months is that they, have to see themselves as real change advocates in the countries, but even more so at the technical level, the officers and the persons who support them have to be talking about these things daily. It is one of the pain points to me that when we come to a meeting, you get very limited information about any member state, and then the next day you open the papers and there are about 4 items on the state. So I think, and it worries me because it goes to the heart of each of us as a citizen, and I worry about it, because if we really, there is room for everybody if you use technology. There's no first prize praise that you will be the only first prize person. You understand what I mean? To me, worries me in the sense that why are we clutching useful information to our bosoms rather than sharing it so that the country next to you could say, hey, I'm doing that too, and why don't we, see if our development partners would agree for us to do a joint project or something like that. So the dearth of information it's not even a dearth of information, it is the unwillingness to share information that I think detracts and holds back the whole process with regard to the single ICT space. I also have to be very conscious, and I am very conscious every day, that those of us who are in the technology space may be taking a lot of things for granted and presuming that when we make a statement or put out a brief or whatever, that everybody was immediately transformed to where we are. And so I'm very careful to make sure that the products that emanate from this program are very simple. Everybody, any or everybody in policy making and government can pick them up and move with them. But it's also something which has to be replicated and supported at the member state level and even in the regional organizations, so that we start to really have a discussion based on how we use technology for the advantage of each country and region. And the point you made about economies of scale and the consequent returns on investment, or the investment that you have to put out to do some of these things, is something that we should be keeping in mind all the time, because of the constrictions in the larger economies that we see already profiling in 2019. So our development partners are not going to be able to turn their eye to us if they themselves are having challenges. So we need to use what we have in the region to make it work for us. And so it's, I think I'll stop there.
Okay. All right. I definitely agree. And certainly, too, I think even for our regional partners, they tend to be even more amenable for regional initiatives than for individual countries trying to pursue an activity, when probably other countries are almost at the same level of trying to implement the same activity.
Yes, I think yes, and as I continue to mull on the discussion here, I think the one of the challenges that showed up in our space, which we may not have even taken on board fully, the whole world is being measured by various indices. On any given day, I'm looking across the board at about 17 indices which measure our countries. And it may have been an unconscious or conscious move by many countries to start pursuing placement in these indices. And so we've sort of lost our way. We're no longer thinking as a regional bloc. We're just thinking, oh, will I move up in the e-government survey next year? But that does not necessarily mean that if you move up in the e-government survey that your doing business profile gets better. So we need to be looking at it across the board, and I think it gives us a beautiful regional moment to look at this and say, okay, what are the big ticket items that we want to be able to do? We want to be able to make our citizens speak with government more. I think government needs to be move itself into a space of being a real innovator, since they, are a big employer in many of our countries, and things like that. But I don't think, perhaps the advent of all of these international measurements has sort of taken our eye off our own CSM&E and forcing us to try to almost compete with each other for want of these international indices.
That is so true. I mean, I have noted it myself. I mean, I guess it probably might not be as diplomatic as you are. I basically think that some of the countries are trying to game the system. You know what the indices are that are being measured, and you basically trying to move individual ones up. But I certainly take the point that, if what you're focusing is on these indices and what you consider, being able to move up in the rankings, but not necessarily ensure that we are moving, whether as a region or individual countries, holistically towards whether it's e-government, whether it's ICT for development or network readiness or whatever some of these assessments are about, then you can easily just lose your way.
Precisely. And I think we may be a little focused on those things. So hopefully I can bring the conversation back to, we can do both. Because if we decided we want to be a real force to be reckoned with and we want to be treated as CARICOM in these indices, I think we punch at a lot higher weight level if we make a conscious effort to do it that way. because then the single ICT space, we will be forced to do things together so that there is a bigger groundswell of all the things we do, and all our countries will move up, and we will all be, the region will have a better profile in those indices.
Absolutely. Okay, so just going back now to our discussion last year and just seeing for some individual things that when we were concluding that discussion, you mentioned some priority initiatives that you were keen to pursue in the coming weeks and months following our August interview. So I wanted to just get a sense as to where things are at now. And one of the priority initiatives you indicated was to work on removing the roaming rates, telecommunications roaming rates across the region. So has any progress been made on that front?
Um, the progress is measured in different ways these days, I suppose, and I have to be as generous as I can be. I would love to say my heartfelt answer would be almost that we haven't done enough. But in fact, from that same meeting in Trinidad, from which the Sindans Declaration emanated, we got a very strong mandate from the heads of government, which sort of helped me solidify my position with regard to moving into negotiations with the telecoms operators and the regulators in the region. That having been said, we have opened the door to start having the conversation, but we have had one bit of conversation with regulators, which was tremendously illuminating in the sense that the regulators have felt not even at the edge of the discussion, they have felt totally out of the discussion. So instead of starting from point 10, point Z or F, we had to go back and start from point A. And so it is more hand holding and I think developing relationships with the regulators, which is okay, but we just need to move at a faster pace so that the regulators understand what are the possibilities and the opportunities and some of the challenges which may pertain in the single ICT space. With the telecoms operators, I am hopeful we continue to be in good conversations thanks to the CTU, the Caribbean Telecommunications Union, and CANTO, which is the Caribbean Association of National Telecoms Operators. And hopefully, before or around the same time when we have the ICT ministers meeting, we will have a fulsome meeting with the enough representatives of the telecoms operators. Again, it is not, everybody looks at it and says, oh, last year she said this and this hasn't happened. A lot of, as you know, policy making and negotiation is more relationship building. And because of the pre-liberalization relationships we had with telecoms operators, some of that relationship has not warmed up or has not changed in some countries, particularly some of the countries that have not yet liberalized their sector. So it is lots of learnings for us at the Secretariat, I believe, and we are moving apace. And second to that is that the Secretariat itself has not been traditionally in the discussions with telecoms operators for many reasons, and I'm sure you can think of them. But in this new dispensation, in the sense that a telecoms operator could also be your data provider and your internet service provider and many other things, the Secretariat is now rightfully and centrally placed from that head's mandate to start having these conversations. So it is a whole set of relationship building and saying why we're now in the space, and that space is likely to change. The telecoms operators already know that the space has changed and is changing, but having a new entrant, i.e. the Secretariat, working with them now is another layer of, for want of a better word, complexity, but we are moving through it. So we have exchanged, I think, information, and we are moving towards having a meeting before the end of October with the telecoms operators to share very strategically their role in the single ICT space and what the region wishes to accomplish using the power of the technology and how telecoms operators can support us in that move.
Okay. Yes, I mean, as much as, I was hoping for great news, but I recognize the reality of the situation. And I do recognize also that the regulators, for various reasons, probably had not been part of the conversation that CARICOM wanted to have, and they then had to be brought in and brought up to speed, and that in itself takes time.
Yeah. We have had, and again, it is time and space and place. And I know everybody's impatient, and I hear your comments about great news. Every move I think we make in the right direction is great news. The region has come from a place. We're a developing region, first of all. We're small island development states. We constantly have to jump and leapfrog all the development objectives that the rest of the world puts out to us, whether it's Millennium Development Goals or Sustainable Development Goals, and our own CSME. So all of this is happening in one pot, and we have to sometimes be very conscious that it is one senior ICT official doing all this work in one member state. Some may have the blessing of more than one, but in some countries, it is the reality is that it's one person, looking at your IT needs, looking at your regulator needs, and all of those things. So everything is great news. Let's keep it positive, but I would love
Yes.
it to start to evolve into um, real parts of the development objective of the region so that we can see that we are actually making moves that the next generation can be comfortable that we are taking care of their future in the best way.
Absolutely. Okay, and another activity that you indicated you wanted to realize would have been the creation of, I guess, some sort of partnership framework for the single ICT space. I guess various stakeholders, experts, resources that in the global ICT space that could probably come to bear and share their insights and resources to assist us. And again, you had probably hoped to at least made some inroads where that was concerned earlier in the year. Has there been any progress?
Again, because of the regional construct, a lot of the progress check marks will actually only evolve when the ICT ministers meet. And so their ability to come together and meet and make very serious decisions is really one of the linchpins for moving the region forward. So we have done a lot of the background work, and the vision for the Single ICT Space partnership is just as you have outlined it, because as you look at other regions, particularly developing regions, they recognized probably 5 or 10 years ago that they could not do it alone. So a lot of them brought in development partners in the first instance, but in the more developed regions, you notice that they bring very frontally into their partnership arrangement the people like Google and Facebook and Microsoft. Those people may be vendors for us, and we may be in another type of contractual arrangement with them on one side of the coin, but in the effort to do things like the disaster management the disaster recovery needs that we might have every time we have a disaster, etc. Those are some of the emerging as some of the major players in there. So we have to be able to, as a region, have two types of conversations and still be gentlemen and gentlewomen when we leave the room. And that is the sentiment behind the partnership, so that we bring all of these partners in to have various discussions on disaster recovery, digital skills, how do we deal with future and emerging technologies, how do we set ourselves up as a research and innovation space in the world. And I'm hoping that at the ministers' meeting they will agree, because of the level and the types of persons we want to engage, ministers will have to make that decision on behalf of the region, because it's not going to be some place where we don't have sources, and those resources don't only lend to money, but you may have to have a cross-pollinated team which continues to work with the partnership, not only your ICT persons. So I need the ICT ministers, and in this particular instance, we are blessed by the fact that Prime Minister Mitchell is also the Minister of Information in ICT in Grenada. So he will more than likely be at the meetings and chair the meetings. So we have high-level input into it right away. But we will need to have almost at the level of heads of government engaged, because you're not going to be only using your ICT practitioners for a partnership of this nature.
Absolutely. All right. And I think as we begin to draw this discussion to a close, I want to just touch on the fact that I guess there is progress being made on the single ICT space, as much as somehow we may hope that the process would have been faster. And I just want to know, what might be some of the key components of which we should be aware moving forward. So I gather, there was a roadmap that, there were certain milestones that we are hoping we would be achieving at certain points. So going forward, and you looking forward, what are the things now that you're saying, oh gosh, we need to get these things done?
Right. They're technical and almost operational things that need to be done. At the level where the integrated work plan for the single ICT space was done, it was a very dense work plan. So one of the things we hope to take to ministers is a plan which shows what each member of the cluster, which are the five mostly ICT related entities in the region, CARICAD, CBU, CTU, Impacts, and the Secretariat, to show very clearly to ministers and hopefully roll it up across each government what every entity expects to be doing in the single ICT space work. We also, as you mentioned at the beginning of our conversation, have to look at real dates because some of those dates started in 2014, but we didn't get the approval until 2017. So a lot has to be pushed forward or evaluated to see if they have actually happened. But on the technical side, a lot of stuff is happening and emerging, as you would well imagine, with regard to spectrum, how we use it, and the need for more and more spectrum as we want to roll out and live with the Internet of Things. So spectrum management for the region to me is critical because I don't think we value that resource enough yet, and so we may be taking a lot of things for granted. The World Radio Conference is coming up again in a couple of months, and the negotiations are strong and hard, and every day I'm reading hundreds and hundreds of pages. I am not the Secretariat is not the representative of the region there. It's the CTU, but still as the ICT technical lead here, I have to be aware of everything else that is going on there. So there are things that people want to use for example, the heads of government at their December meeting talked about something which they call the single communication space, which obviously is going to be a subset of the single ICT space, but nevertheless has some necessities. For example, what band would we want to use to have the regional radio on if we wanted to have a regional radio station? So those spectrum conversations, although they're happening way in Egypt, we need to be able to clue into them, tap into them, and understand what they mean for us at the, at the person in the street level. Spectrum is tremendously important to me. I think we need to also be looking at our human resource development aspirations, actions, and wants for the next decade. We continue to not in a not it's not an indictment. That's just how the world profiles. But we continue to sort of urge our young people and our students into certain avenues. But there are going to be there's a whole plethora of new jobs and new needs emerging in the next 5 and 10 years. And how do we ensure that what happens at kindergarten helps that person who is going to be an adult in the next 10 years to be ready for the new world and with new career opportunities. So the digital skills portfolio and layer is tremendously important, and obviously it forces us to work and look at the human development strategy, which was approved by the heads of government in 2017 as well, and to make sure that we're really marrying the activities and that they're not happening twice, but just happening once for the benefit of the region. The other thing that I would, and I think I probably said it last year because I think it's tremendously important for our region, is that we have to look at our innovation space and in particularly the apps development. There is room for probably 50 apps that I can think of right away, and we talked about some of them, the free movement apps and that type of thing. But how do we find the monetary and technical resources to resource our small and micro enterprises who are working on these things? And it's a very small niche of people as well. How do we give them as the government arm, how do we support them to make sure that these apps come to fruition and help the region? The other thing is that most app developers are not only don't only want to be focused on a regional app. So how do we make regional apps interesting enough for them so that they still can run their businesses, but that we have applications that are perhaps locally built on which understand our culture and everything else and tremendously useful for the region. So I would say that innovation in terms of app development is tremendously important again. And the second layer of that is that, and I said it before, government has to really start coming in every morning, all of us in government and public service, seeing how can I innovate to make the person outside my door feel better, work better, live better. Because I think one of the great lines in our regional mission is about a better quality of life for all of our citizens. So how do we map that as a public sector employee to make it really to innovate to make sure that that person has a good quality of life? And I'm sure you can think of 10 things that you would want automated so that it makes your life easier. And the last, perhaps big thing that comes to my mind now is that we have not, and I probably said it last year again, we have not engaged private sector in a mature, respectful manner to support us with regard to our technology needs and the things that need to happen. And this is not only technology private sector. Other private sector members of our community will benefit and are probably already benefiting from the policies, etc., that we put into place with regard to ICT. How do we bring them in as living, breathing, everyday partners to help us move out into fourth and fifth generation activities with regard to the technology space? So those are the, I think, key things on my mind and key things that I think need to be moved along.
That's some very interesting food for thought, Jennifer. And I mean, I think we can probably even continue a conversation for each one of them for another 2 or 3 hours. But I know that you have such a busy schedule, and I think that we will leave it at that today. I think our listeners would probably, when they sit and think through what you've said, may have ideas and find ways in which they can contribute, they can help to push the needle forward, even in their own environments, even in their own communities. And I just want to say thank you so much again for coming on the podcast and giving us an update, because I know it's tough, because working on regional initiatives, working in policy takes time. And, even I think one might hope that things would have moved a bit faster and so on, but that progress is being made, and working for, 20 plus countries across the region, trying to address and ensure that everybody has a place at the table and is being heard, and that their views are taken into consideration, and hopefully coming out with some meaningful decisions and actions at the end takes time. So again, just thanks again.
And thank you too. I wanted to thank you for even the last podcast last year, which generated quite a bit of regional conversation. So with your permission, I'm going to ask our media persons to work with you, etc., so that we open a space, perhaps on Facebook, so people can put in some comments and ideas, and hopefully not bashing CARICOM, and so that we can move forward, move the needle forward. But I'm more than willing, and I think this is a lovely avenue to get some of the word out as to what the region is thinking and what we need to do. So I'm going to make myself a little more available to you so that we can talk about those 4 or 5 big themes, as each of them perhaps as a half chapter in your podcast, so that we move the conversation ourselves forward. But thank you again for always opening the space for the Secretariat and allowing us to share some of the views and things that are happening here, which are important to the region. And please continue your good work and have a good weekend.
That's it for today's episode. Thank you so much for listening to the ICT Pulse podcast. You can find links to some of the things we talked about on our website, ict-pulse.com. If you like this episode, please show your support by leaving us a review on iTunes, as it will help others find the show. You can email us at info@ict-pulse.com or drop us a note on our Facebook page, facebook.com/ICTPulse, or via Twitter @ICTPulse. We hope you'll join us again for our next episode. Take care.